Okay, so unfortunately, because of time constraints, and maybe this is unfair to Camus. I feel like I've been so mean to the guy, and I like him. I actually like him, so don't get the wrong impression. But I'm frustrated with this essay. But unfortunately, because of time constraints, we're really focusing on what you might call the negative aspects of this essay. In other words, what not to do, how not to, or at least his advice to us, how not to encounter the absurd. So remember, the absurd, just to simplify it, I'm kind of going to give a really dumb, simple definition. The absurd is this relation between the human being and its world, in which that sort of connection is, alienated. Normally when we are living our lives, we are immersed in our world. We just inhabit our world. We go to class. We open the book when the professor tells us to. Right? We just do the things that we do without really much forethought. We are, Heidegger even will argue that we are, so the world and the self are just two sides of the same coin. There really is no separation. But when things break down, whenever we fail at something, or we get our hearts broken, or just life isn't, or even at the end, I think the passage that we read last time, at the end of a long day of work, and we just sit there thinking, what's it all for? Those sort of moments of repose might even bring upon this feeling of absurdity. So it's this alienation, as he puts it, of man from the world. Right? Sort of separates, and I'll just put the human, right? The human being, to make it gender neutral, okay? So there are two ways to respond that are typical. One is really morbid, and that's suicide. Why go on living? Well, yeah, good question, right? Why go on living? Oh, because of this thing. So those are the two responses, and he doesn't like either one. Right? So today I'd like to get through the first section. I don't know if we can, because we're only on page 16, and I told you to read to page 65. But he ends up critiquing two philosophers, well, more than two, but I'm going to focus on two in particular, who he sees as doing this. And he kind of gives them crap for it, because he says these guys are great because they encounter the absurd. They're honest enough philosophers to acknowledge the absurd, this alienation of man from his world. But the way they respond to it is it's not suicide, obviously. Kierkegaard doesn't advocate for suicide, but it's this sort of eluding the absurd. We elude it. He uses that word a lot. We elude the absurd. We cover it up with this hope, this false hope, Camus would say. And who are the two philosophers that I'm going to focus on? One of them we studied in this class. Who does he pick on in this reading? Who's the only other philosopher we covered? I guess Kierkegaard. Yeah. So he's going to have his gripes with Kierkegaard. Anybody have any other idea the other one I'm talking about? Good guess. Jean-Paul Sartre, Heidegger. He actually doesn't seem that critical of those ones. Well, I heard another guess. Justo? No. Chestov? That's actually, no, that's not it. Actually, you're right. He does criticize Chestov, the existentialist philosopher, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. Who else? You probably can't pronounce his name. It starts with an A. Husserl. Husserl, I think is how you're supposed to say it. Husserl. But everybody says Husserl. But you're right, yeah, Chestov is one that he pokes at, because he says Chestov, he gets to this point where everything's absurd. He's, well, that's just God. God is the absurd. So I just put the word God in place of that, right? And it's like, that doesn't resolve the problem, So yeah, you're right. But I'm kind of probably skip over that stuff. But the ones that I'm going to focus on, this is, Kierkegaard, he tells us to find something to have faith in, and just to sort of believe it. And, he's advocating for a very passionate adherence to some sort of ideal. I hate to use the word ideal because Kierkegaard wouldn't have liked it. I guess, Isaac is not an ideal. Isaac is an actually flesh and blood human being that Abraham was proud of. But maybe I'll put it this way, it's not an ideal, but there's something in your life, an element of your life that is concrete. I don't want to discount, Kierkegaard's not some monk who's like, it's not the night of infinite resignation. It is something concrete, but you're sort of, I guess, putting all your eggs in one basket. My life revolves around this one wish, this one passion, this one drive. And Camus sees that as dangerous and maybe even more so naive. I think that's what he focuses on. You're just being silly. The absurd will always rear its ugly head. So you need to be able to embrace it. So I don't think we're gonna have time to really get into what that's gonna look like in depth because of time constraints. On Monday, I'm gonna try to rush through it. If you want to this weekend, you can read the next section and the third section because I will talk about it, but it's just optional. So there's the absurd man is the next part, and then after that is absurd creation. And I'll talk a little bit about those, but basically, right, so the absurd man, Don Juanism is one thing, right? You can be a player. I'm selling it really bad, but that's basically what he says. Be a player, right? Be a player. Don Juan, the guy that just goes from woman to woman. Be a conqueror, just sort of like an adventurer, conqueror, trying new things, challenging yourself. Or an actor. Remember, you just put on different roles and try different things and try to experience as many different human emotions are possible. Those are the different types of absurd men. And then absurd creation. We'll talk more about that on Monday. Let me find a good place to start here, though. I want to get again. We'll probably have to skip the stuff on Chestov, but I might read a few of the lines there on Chestov because some of it doesn't just apply to him. It kind of applies to all of these philosophers or thinkers that he's attacking here. But let me try to find a good spot to begin. And I don't think we quite finished the section on absurd walls, so maybe there's some things there we need to look at first before we move on. Wow, I'm way behind. Yeah, because I'm looking in the 30s, and I'm like, geez, we haven't even covered that yet. I think we stopped on page 19 last time. So let me see. Let me jump forward. Limited universe. Okay, we're still on the absurd. I think we covered that enough. Okay, so let's start on 28 because that's the end of the absurd wall section. I've got something marked here. Maybe that will help us sort of close up what we were on last time, and we can move on to this new material. So the last line of that section on 28, the absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Right, just sort of kind of a recapitulation of the theme there. This must not be forgotten. This must be clung to because the whole consequence of life can depend on it. The irrational, the human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of their encounter. These are the three characters in the drama that must necessarily end with all the logic of which an existence is capable, right? So again, he's compelling us to embrace this absurdity, to not cover it up with hope, to just be super honest about it. And this is what I'm kind of just, to me, skeptical about. Can anybody really live their life like this? Maybe you can if you're Camus. But I think even if you tried to live your life like this, you'd eventually start taking stuff seriously, right? While you're getting into this, your activities. But now the next section is philosophical suicide. And I've got this line on 29 marked. It's at the bottom of the page. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. So now we have more of a common usage of that term, absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intentions and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. Likewise, we shall deem a verdict absurd when we contrast it with the verdict the facts apparently dictated. And similarly, a demonstration by the absurd is achieved by comparing the consequences of such a reasoning with the logical reality one wants to set up. In all these cases, from the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the terms of my comparison, right? I guess the man's wish to kill the guys and his ability to do it when he's got a sword and they've got a bunch of machine guns. There are absurd marriages, challenges, rancors, silences, wars, and even peace treaties. For each of them, the absurdity springs from a comparison. I am thus justified in saying that the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. And again, I said this earlier when I was setting things up, and I guess this maybe is the first time in the reading that we've encountered it in any of these quotes that I've read. But again, when he's talking about the absurd, it has to do with a relationship between the self and the world. It's not actually a thing. It's not an object, right? The world is filled with objects, right? We live in a world where there are houses and roads and signs and all these things that have meaning and significance. Well, when we have this feeling of absurdity, we're kind of divorced from that. We can see the world, but it no longer those signs are just sitting there. We just sort of look at them like, okay, that's a red one and a green one, and it's this tall. It no longer beckons us to stop or turn left or whatever, right? We're completely detached. I think last time I read that passage where he's like talking about walking by the guy in the phone booth who's like on the phone, like you can't hear what he's saying, but he cares, but I'm having this feeling of absurdity, and I'm just walking by him saying, well, why does he care? What does it all matter? In this particular case, and on the plane of intelligence, I can therefore say that the absurd is not in man, if such a metaphor could have a meaning, nor in the world, but in their presence together. And then let's skip forward to the bottom there. There can be no absurd outside the human mind. Thus, like everything else, the absurd ends with death. But there can be no absurd outside this world either. And it is by this elementary criterion that I judge the notion of the absurd to be essential, and consider that it can stand as the first of my truths. Yeah, this is also, I think he's drawing a lot from Heidegger, and this notion of the nothing that we keep coming back to. And this is even, I think, pretty important in Sartre. If you read Sartre's work, Being in Nothingness, there's this idea, and I think there's something to it, that as a human being, there's an emptiness or a nothingness at the heart of our existence. That's how Sartre puts it. For Heidegger, it's not quite as subjective. The nothingness is a little bit more like what he's describing here. It's this sundering of the world when we're alienated from our world. But for Heidegger, and I think Sartre to a certain extent too, it's trying to cover up that emptiness that gives anything meaning. The only reason that we have religion, politics, society, jobs, things that this is a response to nihilism. This is a response to the nothing. This is a way of avoiding the nothing. There's an essay by Nietzsche, one of his first essays, his first published essay, called The Birth of Tragedy. And in that essay, Nietzsche talks about art as a response. In fact, that's pretty close to Camus. When we get to the end, and Camus talks about absurd creation. But for Nietzsche, again, in The Birth of Tragedy, art is a response to this sort of nihilistic despair. And he uses the story of Silenus. There's a myth in Greek mythology, this mythical figure Silenus. He's a satyr. What's a satyr? Anybody know what a satyr is? That's a centaur.
Oh.
But the top half is human, the lower half is not a horse, but a goat. It's like a little goat boy. And they represent like naughtiness, basically, right? Like the female equivalent is the nymphs. They're like these women that I guess like frolic naked in the woods or whatever and have sex with satyrs or whatever, right? But he's supposed to be like this really vulgar satyr who gets really drunk in the woods. And if you find him when he's drunk, because he's a part god, he's like a demigod, he has this divine wisdom. And so if you get him when he's drunk, he'll tell you anything. So there's this king, I forget which one, but whatever. The king captures him, right? Hires some guy to hunt him down, and they pin down Silenus, and they ask him, Silenus, what is the greatest thing for man? What is the greatest thing for humans? And Silenus says, don't ask me the one thing you don't know, you don't want to know the answer to. Please don't have me answer this. And he's like, no, I want to know. He's like, you want to know the one thing that you shouldn't know. And he's like, yes, let me know. What is the one good thing for man? He's like, the best thing for man is to never have been born. He's like, what? Okay, well, what's the second best thing? He's like, to die soon. So this idea is that life's not worth living, that there's no meaning out there. And so the idea, and then Nietzsche says, the Greeks say, screw you, that's not true, right? And the way they do this is through their art, through tragedy, right? They created works of art that were tragic, that were sad. And they're saying, even though things are sad, it's still beautiful, it's still art, we all struggle together. And this is sort of a way of answering Silenus. We do it through some this is sort of, what I'm describing is more like the Dionysian art, the tragic art, but there's also what he calls the Apollonian art, which is kind of the fantasy art. We think of a better world, think of the movie Avatar, I remember when that movie Avatar came out. I never saw that movie, by the way, but I remember watching some news articles that there was like Avatar depression syndrome, people watching that movie and sad that like the world wasn't like the Avatar world or whatever that. But it's like we need art as like sort of an escape or something like that to sort of like give us purpose and like, oh, the superheroes are gonna save it, or at least that world has meaning and things work out in that world. And so it's sort of a reaction to that nihilism that we get, that sort of that mocking from Silenus. Where are we at here? 31, right? Okay. I'll just reread that line I ended on. It's by this elemental criterion that I judge the notion of the absurd to be essential and consider that it can stand as the first of my truths. And I think that's kind of what he's saying, is that, this encounter with the absurd is what forces me to take stock of my existence and try to establish any sense of truth or any sense of right or wrong. Let's go to the bottom of the page there. There exists an obvious fact that seems utterly moral, namely that a man is always a prey to his truths. Once he has admitted them, he cannot free himself from them. One has to pay something. A man who has become conscious of the absurd is forever bound to it. A man devoid of hope and conscious of being so has ceased to belong to the future. That is natural. In a way, maybe this is kind of a response to my concerns. I said last time that I think this essay is somewhat dangerous, and what he's asking us to do is not possible. But in a certain sense, I think he's got a point here, because he's saying, you're gonna jump back into life and try to sort of forget about this, but it's gonna rear its ugly head eventually, right? You're gonna have a shitty day. You're gonna have some sort of day where you're sitting there and going, why, right? And so I guess it's a sign of a healthy human being to be able to sort of just be a realist in that sense. But my point, though, I would say is, though, too, we tend to get lost in our activities. I guess if you sit me down and make me think about it, I'm like, yeah, I guess there is a lot of like loss of hope in the universe, and why am I trying to teach Sartre and Camus and Heidegger, and what's the point, and what is it even gonna, that sort of thing. But, when I'm doing it, I obviously care about it. I get really angry when my students aren't really paying attention, and like, obviously I care, right? Obviously I give a shit, and so I think to sort of keep this sort of like nonchalant, aloof, sort of like undetached, and like I'm just enjoying it from an aesthetic. You can't do that all the time. You're gonna become like the method actor, to use his metaphor, right? What's method acting? Who knows what method acting is? Like I know Robert De Niro does method acting.
like immersing yourself in the role.
Right, like they never break character. Like you're on set and like they're talking to their fellow and they're in the part, right? They're like, "I am Sherlock Holmes." They're like, "Oh, come on, Robert Downey." No, I'm Sherlock. You know, like they, like I know like Robert Downey, not Robert actually, Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, like he plays this psycho guy and like he was in character the whole time. You know, people are like, it was really creepy working with him because he never broke character, right? So, but we all break character, I think, is kind of my point, right? Like sometimes we get absorbed in our character, we become part of it, right? Like, and so even if we are play acting, as he says, we forget that we're play acting. It's just inevitable, you know. You become so immersed in these roles you play. It's like Vonnegut said in one of his books, be careful what you pretend to be, because you become what you pretend to be, or you are what you pretend to be. But it's just as natural that he should strive to escape the universe of which he's the creator. All the foregoing has significance only account of this paradox. Certain men, starting from the critique of rationalism, have admitted the absurd climate. Okay, so here's where I'm glad we got there. Critique of rationalism. You get this from both Kierkegaard and Husserl, and you mentioned Chestov as well, right? So there's this, what he calls a critique of rationalism. And honestly, I don't know, this is debatable, but I almost think he should capitalize the word rationalism, because I think what he has in mind here, it really applies most appropriately to historical rationalism. So when he's using the lowercase rationalism, you're thinking, oh, reason. And in a way, maybe that's true. Like this broadly applies to anybody trying to use reason. He would argue that when we respond to the absurd with hope, we're typically rationalizing. We're trying to reason our way into hoping, and that's the sort of way that we elude ourselves. But most existentialists, and I think they take this from Heidegger and even Husserl as well, were quite critical of historical capital R rationalism, which, believe it or not, we've kind of encountered in this class, although you might not have known it, but we've already talked about Descartes before. He came up pretty early on because I think Kierkegaard talked about Descartes. Descartes was a philosopher he's considered by many historians to be the father of modern philosophy. And there are many other modern philosophers who came after Descartes who were very critical of him, but they all seem to kind of start with the same problems, and they frame philosophy in a very similar way. So in that sense, I think he deserves the title. You know, he had that big of an influence that, you know, maybe his answers to the questions weren't satisfactory to the philosophers that came after him, but they liked the questions, they liked the way they were set up. So what were some of these questions, and what makes Descartes a rationalist in this historical sense? Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that, but I think for our purposes, one thing we can look at is there's this question of, you know, how do I get to reality, right? If I've got this individual human being confronting a world out there, how do I bridge the gap between my experience of that world and the world itself? You know, so one way that philosophers typically pose this problem is they'll say things like, well, let's just say I've got some object in the universe, like a tree. So we've got this tree out there. And now I have a human being who is encountering this tree, right? They come across it and they're having this experience of a tree, right, in their mind, right? That, you know, the light bounces off the tree, goes into my eyes, my brain processes all this information, and then I see it and experience it, okay? So now one question in this situation is, how accurate is my experience of the tree? In other words, how close is my experience of the tree to the actual tree itself, the thing in itself, as some philosophers call it? And there are many ways of answering that question, and the way Descartes, and this is kind of, I'm dumbing it down, this is like the hardcore Cliff Notes version of Descartes, But he was a rationalist, and he thought, well, what we can do is we can use reason to get at the truth of reality, right? We can't use our senses because our senses get in the way. Did you have a comment?
It's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest, who will be there to hear it?
Right, yeah. If the tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? There's a philosopher named Berkeley who actually has an interesting solution to this problem. Berkeley was an idealist and he was an empiricist. So, empiricism is one of the competing schools of thought. But I'm almost hesitant to bring it up because I think that maybe Camus even it would include empiricism in this rationalism with the lowercase r. But like the empiricists say that, well, knowledge comes from your senses and from your experience. But Descartes thought that no, your knowledge comes from your mind and your understanding, from reason. So rationalism, knowledge comes from reason. Empiricist, knowledge comes from experience. So Berkeley, I mentioned him, he's an empiricist. For him, when you say that the tree is, or makes a sound, or whatever you say about it, what that means is that you perceive it. To be is to be perceived, says Berkeley. But what does the perceiving is a mind. So Berkeley, he's kind of odd. Not only is he an empiricist, he's an idealist because he denies that there's anything out there. It's all in your mind, which is kind of like, what? So if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? No. But it still makes a sound, though, because there's always someone to hear it. Berkeley was religious. He believed God heard it. So yeah, God hears everything, sees everything. So, because that's one problem with his view, is to be perceived. So if we leave this classroom, does it disappear? And he's like, no, you're thinking about it right now, and you told me about it. He's like, yeah, but you're not thinking about every dot on the ceiling and but God can see everything. So, but the way that Descartes resolves this issue, how do I bridge the gap between my mind and the thing? I do it through reason and rationality, mainly through mathematics. He gives a lot of examples, like he talks about my experience of the sun. When I use my experience of the sun that I get through my senses to make judgments about the sun, I'm way off. Imagine that you were living in like 500 BC and you're just looking up at the sun and somebody asked you, how far do you think that is from us? What would you guess? You'd probably be way off, right? Yeah, I don't know, 50 miles or something, like far, 100 miles. Like it's pretty hot, I can feel it, so it's not that far. You'd be guessing, how big is it? Like 40 feet, but that's wrong. But that's the as Descartes puts it, that's the idea of the sun that you arrive at through your senses. But the idea that you arrive at through mathematical reasoning, that is more accurate, that is more true. So it's your understanding and your reasoning that gets you at truth. So again, this is sort of the rationalism that a lot of the existentialists, they kind of attack it, and for kind of novel reasons, because when you get to Heidegger, one of Descartes' famous quotes is, I think, therefore I am. Right? So there's Descartes says, well, when it comes down to it, I can doubt a lot of things. Maybe my whole life is a dream. Maybe I'm in the Matrix or whatever, right? But there's one thing I can never doubt, says Descartes, and it's this. Even if I were in a Matrix, even if, like he says, there's an evil genius tricking me and, all this stuff, even if all that were the case, I know that I exist. I think, therefore I am. Heidegger kind of takes issue with that. He's like, well, what the problem with it, is that Descartes, what he starts with is what he calls his cogito. Because he says, okay, well, I know that I'm here. Well, what am I? I'm a thinking thing. That's the Latin phrase, I think. The cogito is the thinking thing. Descartes says, I'm going to sort of doubt everything else. I'm going to start with what I know for certain, that I exist. And I'm not going to work my way out and get to the world, the thing itself, until I'm absolutely certain that I'm correct. I'm going to follow reason, I'm going to follow mathematics, and all the stuff that is certain, that can't be doubted, and I'm going to bridge the gap between the self and the world. Well, the problem here is, for someone like Heidegger, when you negate the world and start with the self, what is there left? What is the self, right? For Heidegger and the existentialists as well, these are things that are inseparable. You know, Descartes gives us a list. A thinking thing, it's a thing that thinks, has senses, imagines, understands, has a will. You know, he gives a list of like 5 or 6 things, but there's not much content there. Those are all verbs. What is a mind when it's separated from everything? No experience at all, just a mind. What's left? There's nothing there. So Heidegger, he kind of inverts Descartes and says, no, it's not I think, therefore I am. Thought is not primary. Having a self or a mind. Being is primary for Heidegger. I am, therefore I think. I'm thrown into being. What we call a self, what we call a thinking thing, a self-consciousness, is something that develops in reaction to what is. We're thrown into the world and we have this sort of primal awareness of the things around us. Even as babies, we know, like our parents pick us up and we get scared because it's too high or whatever. Like, this is something that is primal for Heidegger, being the things are. And in fact, typically, there is no self in our experience. When we're going about our everyday activities, when, you know, Heidegger likes to use the example of the guy in a workshop with a hammer. You know, when I'm using the hammer, I'm hammering away, and I'm in the midst of my activities, I'm not separate from the hammer. There is no self, there's no distinction. I'm just sort of flowing with my activities. But if I pick the hammer up and it's too heavy, or the handle falls off or something, then all of a sudden that sort of workflow is interrupted, and I have to separate myself from the world. I have to separate from the rest of, and I see all the objects separate, and I see how it all fits together, and it's not working. You know, normally, I think I give this example already, but you're walking through a door, you're not thinking about walking through a door. You're not like, I'm walking through a door, I'm about to walk through the door, I'm gonna grab the handle, I'm gonna turn it left, I'm gonna pull the door out, I'm gonna put one foot in front of the other. No, you do these things. You just do them. It's not until you get to the door and it's locked, and you're expecting it to be open. You're just like kind of flowing, and then, doesn't work. Now I am separate from this thing, and there's this lesion between your activities and yourself, and then you develop thought and cognition in response to it. But theory, thought is response to being, and being amidst an environment, not the other way around. So that's one big critique that existentialists are going to have of rationalism in general. But another big critique, and this is I guess the one that Camus is going to be focusing more in this essay here, is that reason only goes so far. You know, reason cannot resolve every single thing. And if you try to resolve everything rationally, ultimately you either hit a wall or you end up with contradictions. You know, like a lot of logical systems. If you ever take like the second semester of logic, you might learn about Gödel and his incompleteness theorem, right? He basically proves that any system, mathematical or logical, is always either going to be incomplete. In other words, it can't tell you everything about everything, or it's inconsistent. It's going to say things that are contradictory. If it's so complete and can talk about everything, it can talk about itself, and as soon as you start talking about yourself, you end up with some paradoxical and contradictory claims. So reason has a limit. What is the response to that, though? Kierkegaard says, well, screw reason then. Live absurd, remember? Be absurd. You can't explain yourself. Abraham can't explain himself to Sarah, but he knows he's right. It's just absurd. Embrace the absurd, right? And so that's sort of where Kierkegaard goes. Where does Husserl go? Now, he's someone we haven't really talked about, and he's a very dry philosopher, so I hate to teach him because he's kind of boring. He's one of the most boring philosophers there ever was. But he approaches this question basically like, look, we can't answer these questions. Reason can't answer these questions. We're never going to get to the thing in itself. You just have to bracket all this stuff, all these metaphysical questions about like, what is the actual world like apart from my experience? Does God exist? Do we have free will? All these like traditional metaphysical questions that philosophy's tried to answer. Husserl says that won't work. We've tried for centuries, and you get all these different answers, and reason will convince you that God exists, and reason will convince you that God doesn't exist. Kant was sort of right about that. So reason has a sort of limit. So what is Husserl's reaction? Well, what philosophy can do, it can describe. It can describe things, it can describe them, and science can describe things, a description. That's what you get with science. Science doesn't tell you if something's good or bad, it just tells you how it is, right? It's not good that the sun is gonna burn up in a certain amount of time, but it just is, and that's what science does. And so Husserl tries to do a similar thing to philosophy by developing this, technique, methodology, what you call it, but he develops the phenomenological method, phenomenology. So, and for Camus, he's ultimately going to say that this ends up just being another form of rationalism. It critiques rationalism, but then it falls into the same traps as rationalism. So let's see how that works. And again, I'm going to try to keep it simple because Husserl is not simple, and he's not that interesting either. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. And if there's any Husserl people out there watching this video later, I don't mean to offend you, I'm going to dumb it down quite a bit, just to keep it simple. So phenomenology, one thing Husserl seemed obsessed with was creating a method of doing philosophy that could become a convention. He looked at science and he thought, like many of the existentialists that came after Husserl actually was before a lot of these guys, he saw the limits of reason. He didn't like Kierkegaard. He thought Kierkegaard was nuts, but he thought Kierkegaard has a point. Reason can only go so far. The modern philosophers, people like Descartes, and even to a greater extent, people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they made a lot of promises. They were like, look, we were really screwed up before the modern period because religion and philosophy and science were all thrown together and it messed things up. But now we're independent, we're free, we're completely liberated. Science can be free to just do what it's supposed to do. We can use reason to solve all these problems. And not only will reason solve all these scientific problems, but reason will solve political problems, ethical problems, these Enlightenment values, things like human rights, the rights of man, the French Revolution. All this stuff happened during the Enlightenment period, was born during the Enlightenment period and culminated in the French Revolution. But how did the French Revolution work out? It was a really mixed bag, but most historians think it was a pretty terrible time for Europe. Maybe it was a necessary terrible time, but it was pretty terrible. And so the idea was like reason's gonna solve all our problems. Well, it didn't. It actually made some things worse, maybe some things better. So this is one of the critiques of the moderns, of people like Husserl, the phenomenologist, and then the existentialist who were quite influenced by him. So, but there's one thing that he did admire though. He said, look, we did get something out of the Enlightenment. We got the scientific method. And there are quite a few philosophers who, I think they misunderstand the phenomenologist or they misread Husserl, which is easy to do. It's not an easy read. But he often gets labeled as anti-science, that he's against science, and he thinks science is bullshit. That is wrong. If anything, I think he's jealous of science. He admired science. He thought that at least science had the scientific method. There's, physicists might agree or disagree on what the truth is, on the real cutting edge stuff, but they don't disagree on the scientific method. They don't disagree on the basics. And whenever they come up with this discovery, they can publish their results in a journal, and any physicist anywhere around the world can read it and try to replicate it and decide whether it's true or false. Well, we don't really have anything like that in philosophy, and Husserl thought we could get that with phenomenology. So what is phenomenology? Again, I'm going to really dumb it down, but to keep it basic, phenomenology is the study of phenomena, but it studies phenomenon in a particular way that is distinct from science. So first off, what is the word phenomenon, or phenomena is the plural? What does that even mean? What's a phenomenon? It's actually one of the most generic words in the English language, but it's almost like the word thing. What is a phenomenon? It's something that happens, an event. Yeah. The only time you ever hear the word, it's usually like, that was an unexplained phenomenon, or that was a weird phenomenon. So people associate it with something unique, but no, it just means something that happened. So when he says that phenomenology studies phenomena, well, how does that make it different than science? Science studies phenomena, biology studies the phenomenon of life, and chemistry, chemical reactions, and the properties of matter, and so on and so forth. So how's phenomenology different? Well, Husserl says that it studies the phenomenon from the perspective of the first person, that science does it from the third person. You just describe things and their objective qualities, right? Like this substance has this many of these kind of atoms and these kind of molecules, and you're just describing an objective quality. But phenomenology tries to get at it from how is this thing experienced by the observer? What is it about the experience of, and again, I'm going to keep it simple, like you might do a phenomenology of houses. What is it like to experience a house? Husserl would not have wasted his time with that. He'd probably be angry that I'm even using it as an example. But again, I want to keep it stupid, okay? So, how do we define a house scientifically? I don't know if we do that with science. I guess architects do or whatever. But what is the phenomenon of houses? Well, we're going to ask ourselves, what is essential about that experience and how that starts? And this is where I think Camus likes Husserl. We start with a description. So, and we try to do it without any metaphysical presuppositions. In other words, we try to just tell it like it is. We try to just describe things as they appear to us, and we try not to put a label on them, good or bad or whatever. We just describe them, right? We come up with a phenomenological description, as Husserl would say. So let's go back to the house. So a phenomenologist say, okay, I'm going to describe my experience of houses. When I walk to this building and I see that it's a house, well, what makes me think it's a house? Well, because it's the way it's shaped, right? It's solid. It's a solid structure. There's some solidity to it. It's got a driveway. There are windows in it. There's a door. There are all sorts of fixtures. I can see lights in the window. So there must be some people in there. So I'm just describing it. That's the first part of the phenomenologist project. After that, though, I do what Husserl calls phenomenological, or eidetic, eidos is the Greek word for essence, eidetic reduction. I reduce that experience to its essence. So I start to strip away elements. And then I start to ask myself, is it still a house? So for instance, let's say there's no yard. Would I still call that a house? Would I still experience? Yeah, I think so. I prefer a yard. I like houses with yards, but I would still experience it as being a house. Would I experience it as being a house if there were no windows? I would, yeah. I mean, again, still I prefer if they did. How about if there were no windows, no doors, no way to get inside of it? It was just a big square, like, structure with no entryways. Yeah, I'm saying no, it's not a house at that point, right? Now, phenomenologists could sort of argue about this and come up with no, and so this sort of thing, but that's what we're supposed to get at least this is his argument. Phenomenology is supposed to get at the essence of our experiences. And he didn't waste his time with things like houses or chairs or tables. He talked about the phenomenon of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to imagine something, to have an emotion, to be angry? In fact, Sartre spends a lot of time talking about the phenomenology of emotions. What sort of structures have to be in place to make you feel shame or pride or these other things? What are these sort of essential elements of that? And it's that second part, I guess, of the phenomenologist's method that Camus seems to have an issue with here. It's not the descriptive part. He kind of likes that. He's like, I like the idea of just describing experience and not putting a judgment on it. But when you try to sort of reduce things to their essence, that's where he doesn't like it. And you see why? What's the problem with that? What's the problem with phenomenology? I mean, is there a way to really get at the essence of certain experiences? Is there really something essential about shame? Maybe there is. I'm just kind of posing the question. He mentions Spinoza in here very briefly, and I'm not going to spend, it'll take me too long to find the passage, so I don't know exactly what he says, but he says something like that Spinoza, there's passages in Spinoza's Ethics that are quite embarrassing because there's chapters in the Ethics where Spinoza, he's a hard determinist. He thinks that we really don't have free will and like all actions are determined by causes, previous causes. And he spends all these chapters. I mean, the first part of the book is kind of, I'm not following it, but it's more plausible. But when you get to the end and you get to emotions, he starts to describe emotions like they follow set laws of nature, right? Like if someone acts this way to me, then I respond with anger, and then and then I act this way, and it's like very causal account. And I'm like, are emotions really like that determinable or predictable? No. Like one thing somebody might react to completely different than somebody else. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I don't know why this one popped in my head. I guess because of like some recent news. But if you remember the events that happened in Charlottesville, I guess it's been like 5 years ago. There was like all those white supremacists, and that one guy ran over the protester and killed her. You know what I'm talking about? Well, I remember I was getting into an argument with this young lady. I think I had a party or something, or an art opening at my space about 2 weeks after that happened. And she was just talking about, she was obviously like super liberal and freaking hated Trump. And she's like, oh my God, he's racist, fascist, like the country, And I was just like, yeah, I mean, I was sort of like, I agree. I think it's sad that we're at this point. I think it's sad that we're really divisive. I was like, but, I was talking to my landlord at the time, and he's an immigrant. He's from China. And I was talking to him about it. And it's weird because he had a completely different, reaction. The people, the young lady that I was talking about, her reaction was much more calming. Oh, we live in such a racist society, and racism is everywhere, and people are so racist, and America's racist, we're so hateful. Well, he actually had the opposite reaction, this Chinese immigrant. He's like, I can't believe that these people quit work, or took a day off work to protest against the racists, like the people, the young lady that got run over. He's like, no one would do that in my country. He's like, they might care about you, but they're not gonna risk getting in trouble with the government or their boss. Or he's like, I love the American spirit. You're gonna go out there for people, you don't even know them, but you want to accept them and say hello. So it's like, I think both reactions were warranted. I mean, it was a horrible thing. It was a violent thing. But on the other hand, there were people there that were fighting. Someone died actually for something that they believed in. Shouldn't have, but so I think that's the thing, is there really like a one-to-one correspondence between this event happens and this is the emotional reaction that's gonna occur, right? So I think that's kind of more or less Camus' critique of the phenomenologist that tries to get at what is the essence of being ashamed? What is the essence of of having using your imagination? For Camus, this smacks of Platonism, right? He says that towards the end of the chapter, right? This sounds a lot like Plato, which is kind of an insult, I guess, to Husserl. I mean, everyone loves Plato and they think he was brilliant, but no one wants to be a Platonist, I mean, anybody ever studied Plato? You know anything about him? So Plato, he has a theory of forms, and in a way, this comparison is not completely without merit, because the word forms in Greek is the word eidos, which can also be translated as idea. Eidos. And Husserl, he talks about doing an eidetic reduction. When I take that description and I reduce it to its essence, eidos, right? So Plato has a very robust metaphysical theory. Maybe some of you might be familiar with the allegory of the cave from Plato. Sometimes you hear this in pop culture. I would say like the movie The Matrix kind of ripped it off in a way, right? The story of the cave, there's all these prisoners who are in a cave, and they live their whole life in this cave, and they're tied up against the wall, and all they can do is look at this wall in front of them, all these shadows. Behind them is this bonfire, And every once in a while, these puppets will come out in front of the bonfire. So they see shadows their whole life. But they don't know they're shadows. They think that that's actually reality. It's not until one of them escapes and is able to turn around and see the fire and all that to actually realize what's real. And eventually they get out of the cave and they see the earth and all that stuff. But this is a metaphor for Plato of the philosopher coming to have knowledge of the forms. And for him, the forms, these were perfect, ideal archetypes, ideas, blueprints in heaven. I mean, I don't even want to say in heaven because that's too local. They're outside of time and space. But all of the physical world is really just a shadow. It's really just an illusion. All the things that we see through our senses are illusory. All the things that we get through our body are temporary, they're fleeting, they're always changing, they're never in a constant state. But the world of forms is this other, it's outside of that. It's perfect, it's unchanging, and everything in this world is a imperfect copy of the perfect form. So even like desks and chairs, right? He's gonna say there's a form of chair and a form of desk. And these are they're the cause of this world. Which kind of is like, how does that work? How does the idea of a desk cause a physical desk? Well, through our soul. Our mind and our soul understands the concept of deskness, for lack of a better word. And when a carpenter makes a desk, he knows he has to make it a certain way. He can't make it with a wacky surface where stuff rolls off of it. He has to have enough support so it doesn't wiggle. He knows what a good desk is because he has that concept in his mind. Where'd that concept come from? From nowhere, says Plato. It just always has been. What makes a good desk good is always true. What makes a good human being is always true. And the philosopher is trying to understand the forms, which don't change. Unlike, the circle that I draw up here on the board, first off, is not a circle, right? I can't draw a perfect circle. I'm not that good. And even if I was like a robot can't even draw a perfect circle. Y'all know that, right? There are no circles in nature. You can't do it. This line would have to have no width at all to be exactly 360 degrees. So if there's no circles in the world, where do circles exist? They must exist somewhere, says Plato. There are things that are true about them. All the stuff you learn in geometry about determining the diameter, circumference, and the relationship to the ratio, the diameter is always pi, all that. This is true. So if it's true, where is it true? It's true in the formal, the forms, right? The higher world, what Plato called the intelligible realm that is unchanging and perfect. And everything in this realm is like I said, an imperfect copy of that higher realm. So Camus kind of saying, Husserl, in a way, he's not as metaphysical, I guess you could say, as Plato, but this idea that everything has an essence is very Platonic, is very much akin to Plato. And this is an illusion, right? This is more false hope. Right? So both Kierkegaard with his sort of, let's embrace the absurd. Well, you're not really embracing it, you're just calling it something like, God or whatever, just like Chestov does. And you're trying to cover it up with some story you're telling yourself. This is just another form of illusion. But Husserl, he's trying to cover it up with reason. He's critiquing reason, and then he ends up just using reason over again to sort of follow it up. I'm trying to find a couple passages here so I can actually let him do some of the talking. So I'm reading now I'm looking at the Chestov stuff. I said I was going to skip Chestov, but let's go into 37. This is kind of, I guess, towards the end of Chestov when he's segueing into Kierkegaard. At the top of 37, he says, everything is sacrificed here to the irrational, and the demand for clarity being conjured away, the absurd disappears with one of the terms of its comparison, right? So I guess this is the world gets disappeared in favor of the self, right? And the self has this strong sense of purpose. Abraham has Isaac or whatever, right? The absurd man, on the other hand, does not undertake such a leveling process. He recognizes the struggle, does not absolutely scorn reason, and admits the irrational. Thus, he again embraces in a single glance, all the data of experience, and he is little inclined to leap before knowing, right? Kierkegaard is known for the leap, right? Taking that leap of faith. He knows simply that in that alert awareness, there is no further place for hope. So again, both of these philosophers, whether it's Kierkegaard or Husserl, we're kind of getting into this right now. They're both trying to find salvation or shelter in this hope, which is ultimately false hope for Camus. And so what is he saying too, though? I guess Kierkegaard wants us to embrace absurdity in the sense of embracing irrationality, being completely irrational. And then Husserl's almost like, well, let's just be hyper-rational and just describe stuff. Not try to give a reason why, but just describe how. But like throughout this essay, Camus seems to want us to try to skirt a line between these two extremes. It's not that we completely reject reason. Just because we know reason has limits doesn't mean we have to completely reject it. And this is what kind of pisses me off. I don't know, maybe I'm gonna get slightly off topic here, but when you take a class in logic, I find that a lot of logicians, when they get to Gödel's proof that I talked about earlier, and they, a lot of them don't like it and they want to show how it's bullshit. Because Gödel's proof is kind of stupid when you actually explain what it really means. This mathematician, logician Gödel, the way that he showed that a system is always incomplete is he used this logical system that had been developed by these philosophers at the time, and he constructed a theorem that's a statement that's true and doesn't need any other statements to be proven. And the theorem was this. All it said was, this statement is not provable. That's all it said. It said, this statement is not provable. And it's true. The statement was not provable. So it's a true statement that can't be proven, right? And so people get all upset. They're like, oh my God, like Russell, Bertrand Russell, who helped devise this system, felt like his whole life was destroyed because of this, But I guess that's kind of fair because Russell did the same thing to Frege about 20 years earlier, right? Frege did this. Frege was a mathematician that he used set theory to try to construct a full, complete logic. And set theory doesn't work because to have set theory be complete, you'd have to have a set of all sets. And there can't be a set of all sets. Do you know that paradox? The set of all sets. Does the set of all sets contain itself? Yeah, right. So it's like that would be another set. And it just keeps going on. There can't be a set of all sets. There's a similar thing here. If you have a system of logic that can analyze everything, it can analyze itself and it falls apart. It starts making contradictory, self-referential statements like, I always lie. Is that true or false? Did we cover the liar's paradox already? Right? Like if I'm lying, I'm telling the truth. I'm telling the truth, I'm lying. It's just, I. But we are like a camera. We can take pictures of everything, but not ourselves, kind of thing. That's what we elude. And so. Again, for Camus, both of these approaches, they try to eliminate, I guess you could say Kierkegaard eliminates the world over the self, and with Husserl, it's the opposite. And I don't really think he spends a lot of time on this, but it's true. The critique would, I think, extend to Husserl as well, because Husserl focuses on just describing experience, and when he gets to describing the self, it's a very empty shell of a self. It's like the Cartesian cogito, the thinking thing. He calls it like the transcendental self or something like that. And it's just basically what you get left over when you negate everything else. Husserl's like, well, what is the self? Well, it's not anything. It's like, it's the negation of all other things. It's what's having the experience. It's not in the experience. And so, anyway, let me find a good passage here to end class with, because we're almost out of time. Let me say something about Kierkegaard. This is on page 41. Actually, let's back up. Let's go to the bottom of page 40. I'm gonna read that whole long paragraph that kind of concludes the section on Kierkegaard, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Husserl on Monday. But I do want to spend more time on Monday, trying to wrap this up and going over more positive aspects of this essay. Okay, if this is not what you're supposed to do, then how are you supposed to embrace the absurd? But let's try to wrap this up. Let's look at the bottom of 40, that last paragraph. So it's a matter of living in that state of the absurd, right? Not trying to resolve one of the elements of the relation. I know on what it is founded, this mind and this world straining against each other without being able to embrace each other. I asked for the rule of life of that state, right? And I mentioned this earlier. What is the rule of life of that state? It's an ethics of quantity. Right? We'll talk more about that on Monday. What I'm offered neglects its basis, negates one of the terms of the painful opposition, and demands of me a resignation. I ask what is involved in the condition I recognize as mine. I know it implies obscurity and ignorance, and I am assured that this ignorance explains everything and that this darkness is my light. But there is no reply here to my intent, and this stirring lyricism cannot hide the paradox from me. One must therefore turn away. Kierkegaard may shout in warning. And actually, we reread this. I remember this passage from earlier this semester. If man has no eternal consciousness, if at the bottom of everything there were merely a wild, seething force producing everything, both large and trifling, in the storm of dark passions, if the bottomless void that nothing can fill underlay all things, what would life be but despair? This cry is not likely to stop the absurd man. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. If in order to elude the anxious question, what would life be? One must, like a donkey, feed on the roses of illusion. Then the absurd mind, rather than resigning itself to falsehood, prefers to adopt fearlessly Kierkegaard's reply, despair. Everything considered, a determined soul will always manage. And I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know if a determined soul will always manage. But he's kind of saying, remember that sort of, I guess, kind of dichotomous question that we got at the beginning of the semester. Look, either life has meaning at the bottom or it's all despair. So it must have meaning, is sort of Kierkegaard's reply. Otherwise it would be, but he's like, no, I'll take despair, right? And he says, a determined soul will manage, right? We'll be able to embrace that absurdity and get the most out of life, in the process. So anyway, we'll see a little bit more how he treats Husserl, although I think I covered enough probably today. We'll see how he treats Husserl, and then we'll get through the end of this. We only have a few little passages I want to read from part 1 and try to wrap things up. If you can, I'd be really shocked if we get there, but if you have a time this weekend, you might go ahead and read the Nietzsche excerpt that I have posted called The Greatest Weight. It's only a couple pages, so we might have time at the tail end of class next time to cover it. And don't forget too, I'll be posting an extra credit opportunity on Blackboard sometime today.